Ashtart fell forward as the magic shattered. Her head pounded and her vision dimmed, a sign that she would lose consciousness. Ryan caught her before she could hit the ground and he shouted out at her in worry. But all that came out of her lips was the muttering of Loina's name. Ryan cradled her in his lap as he sat on the ground covered in lilies of the valley. He'd thought she'd have succeeded the last time. She leaned closer as she mumbled out, "I need to go back," and Ryan could only stare forward. "I know," he said in a quiet voice. He knew he'd gotten in her way and that's why her spell had failed. If a third party deliberately interfered with a spell, the caster would experience great backlash from the spell. And even though he knew he'd put her in the line of danger, he'd still intervened. But he couldn't have let her go just yet. After all, the spell that had brought her here was a spell to find one's destiny, so that could only mean he was part of her fate. He apologized as he looked down at the raven-haired girl in his arms. "I'm not ready to let you go just yet," he said. But then he smirked as he said in a much louder voice, would he trust Ryan not to harm that child if he'd said those words? And his intended target for his last words appeared behind him. Captain Kylos and Caven of Ryan's Knightage looked at them in concern as he crouched close to a nearby tree. He apologized as he referred to Ryan as the young master, but soon corrected his words as he said, "Your Grace." He'd only come by because the flow of the magic had seemed irregular, so he'd come to investigate. "So were you eavesdropping?" Ryan questioned and the captain called out Ryan's name in apology. But then he said, head still bowed, that the lady was not from their country and Ryan was aware of that. At his words, Ryan clutched at Ashtart tighter as if she might disappear at any moment. "She couldn't stay there forever," the knight said, and he was worried, but Ryan's voice soon cut off his words as he questioned in a menacing voice if the knight was worried for him or for Ashtart. Was he afraid that Ryan would once again go on a mad rampage? The air around Ryan changed subtly, but the knight was aware enough to know not to say the wrong thing unless he wanted to lose his life. Ryan turned and looked at the captain as he said darkly that such an action would be fitting for the slayer of Elferman. Captain Kylos tried to protest, but Ryan paid him no heed as he turned his attention to the little girl in his arms. He looked at the sleeping Ashtart as he said in an intrigued voice, "What a strange little girl." Even though she had worn clothes fit for a noble when she'd arrived there, she'd preferred to stay in the corner, where she'd felt more comfortable. And she'd spoken of hunger as though it was a special talent of hers. She'd also thought of small acts of kindness as greater value than necessary. Ryan wondered if maybe she'd been abused because of the extraordinary power she'd possessed. And what he saw reflected at him was the little boy he'd once been. As he spoke, Captain Kylos shed tears for all Ryan had endured and said in an anguished whisper, "My lord." Loina rested her head on her arms as she lay on the kitchen table. She heard a faint voice call out her name, but sleepiness kept her from understanding who shouted out her name. But didn't that sound like the princess? Loina's eyes shot open with a jolt, and she realized it was the princess's voice. She jumped up and with a shout, exclaimed loudly, "Your Highness." But as she looked around the quiet kitchen, her heart sank once more because the princess was nowhere in sight. She sighed as she realized it was nothing but a dream. She looked out the window to see darkness had fallen and she wondered if Sir Ashton had any news about the princess. Loina sat with a cup of sugary milk in her hands, looking the worse for wear as she thought about the princess. She gazed down at the white liquid, the princess's favorite drink, and she trembled as memories of the princess came to mind. Her bright smile as she tried on one of the new dresses she'd received from the crown prince. And how she'd smiled so beautifully and so full of joy as she'd refused Loina's help to put on the dress, and her happiness as Loina had patted her head. Tears fell into the milk as Loina cried for the princess she missed. She berated herself for not helping the princess more. Why did she expect the princess to be good at everything? She clenched her fists, furious at herself for letting her do so much on her own. Her fury grew and she slammed her fist on the table as she shouted out, "How could I have let her disappear?" She'd made a promise to that person that she would protect the princess. She let out huffs of breath as she tried to get control of her emotions. As she settled down, she heard a knock on the door and Loina got up in a hurry. Could it be the princess? Her heart soared high as hope rose, and she quickly made her way to the door. With each step she took, her mind conjured up all sorts of greetings for the princess. She must have just gotten lost. She must have been wandering around a strange place. Loina tried to rationalize it, but as she swung the door open, the sight that greeted her was not the princess she'd expected, but instead it was Sir Ashton. She rushed to ask him if he'd found the princess, because that could be the only reason he'd come to find Loina. But Sir Ashton looked to be in great discomfort as he tried to answer. But before he could, another person stepped out from the shadows. Dressed in his usual imperial attire, the Crown Prince Miragen told Loina, "There is something I wish to ask you about Princess Ashtart." His appearance shocked Loina because, for what reason did he wish to seek information about the princess now? Loina looked at the Crown Prince cautiously. She questioned him in a careful tone as she said, "Didn't the High Priest order you not to set foot in the Empress's palace?" At her words Prince Miragen's eyes cooled and he said in an equally chilling voice as he grabbed the door near Loina, that since he'd already been there once, what would have changed with a second visit? He knew that everything started to go awry upon his first encounter there. The day he'd met Princess Ashtart for the first time. It wasn't his intention to step foot in the Empress Palace, but circumstances led him there. He'd been speaking with the High Priest Horium. The priest had come to see him, and when the prince had asked him the reason for his visit, he jovially laughed as he said he was not a cold person, that he'd only visit for a specific purpose. But the prince knew that to be a lie, so instead of entertaining pointless talk, he'd urged the high priest to tell him his point of coming there. Horium, who'd realized he hadn't fooled the prince, finally spoke up. He leaned forward as he told the prince, "I hope today you will receive God's revelation." He whispered words, only for the prince to hear as he told the prince that a rebellious person with impure intentions will approach Princess Amaryllis on this day. The prince's eyes widened in shock at his words. Horium hoped that Prince Miragen would protect the light of the empire. But Prince Miragen frowned as he continued to listen. He knew well that what the high priest called God's revelation was a blatant lie, for the high priest's influence had grown immensely since he'd carried out the oracle 10 years ago, so it was indeed not difficult for him to find out information like this. As the priest turned to leave, the prince questioned if he was the right person to carry out such an important task, like protecting the princess, but the priest was only too happy to answer. There was no other sorcerer as talented as the crown prince in the empire. But Prince Miragen knew of one person whose talent far exceeded his own. Someone with much more magic potential than the crown prince himself, and that person was none other than the second prince of this empire, Prince Noah. If the high priest had asked Prince Noah, he too would have done his best to protect the princess, their lovely sister, whom they adored. Before he'd left, the high priest had relayed a message that she would very much wish to have a tea party with her brother. The prince knew that the high priest was not as innocent as he appeared to be, but he also knew that he treated Riley like a daughter, so he wouldn't harm her. As he approached the garden where he knew his little sister's tea party was to be had, he frowned at the unsettling feeling he had. And just as he'd had that thought, he heard shrieks of terror fill the air. The scene he'd walked in on was that of an intruder aiming a sword at the little princess. Prince Miragen rushed forward as he clashed swords with the assailant, and he stepped in front of the princess as he took a defensive stance. The man leaped back and laughed manically as he said, "I wondered who it was." So the Crown Prince Miragen decided to show up. Prince Miragen was surprised that the attacker knew him as he vaguely heard the maids fuss over the princess behind him. The attacker laughed at his look of surprise, and that only annoyed the prince, but he tried his best to conceal it. The energy around the man bothered the prince, and he wondered if he should take the man's life immediately, but the attacker spoke up, interrupting his thoughts. Nobody in the empire was unaware of the crown prince's talent in sorcery, and they claimed he was especially skilled in Roxic offensive magic. The man spoke in an arrogant tone, and as he lowered his sword, he told the prince he'd be honored to show the prince a spell he'd learnt. He bowed in mock respect as he spoke, but when he looked up, he possessed the eyes of a deranged man. The prince clenched his jaw in frustration because he knew if he used magic without a protective shield, Riley and the servants would be injured. The prince masked his anxiety with a look of indifference as he pointed his sword at the man and said in a bored tone, "You must be quite confident coming here at such a busy hour. Try not to disappoint me." because if you do, death awaits." His words only seemed to excite the man as he giggled crazily. He raised his hand and as he shouted out the spell, a westriok. Black tendrils of smoke rose all around him. And this stunned the prince because he had not expected such a spell to leave the man's lips. The vibration of the spell shattered the windows all around the room and the maids screamed in fright. They huddled around the princess in an attempt to protect the princess from the falling shards of glass, and the princess closed her eyes as she waited for the inevitable pain, but when nothing happened, she peeked one eye open, only to see a bright light. A protective shield surrounded and protected them from attacks and falling debris. It was the prince's magic that cocooned them, and he breathed deeply from the sudden activation of the spell. The entirety of the room had been destroyed. The sudden burst of magic had put pressure on him, but that was not the only thing that put strain on his body. While putting defensive magic up for the princess, he'd been injured because he'd let his guard down. He winced at the throbbing pain shot through his side and he grasped it to put pressure on the wound. The man suddenly let out a violent cough and with it came a spurt of blood. The action surprised the prince. What was wrong with him? The man grabbed at his neck, and a look of discomfort covered his face. He'd thought he'd perfected the spell, but that seemed to not be the case. Was the spell incomplete? Upon hearing his words, the prince realized his reason for coughing up blood. The caster can experience two side effects when a spell goes wrong. Either when the spell has been interrupted or when the spell has been improperly translated, and it seemed to be the latter in this case. The prince could not believe how incredibly foolish the man was for using that type of magic. The man told the prince in a regrettable voice that he couldn't die with his last spell being a failure and they would meet again. And with that the man turned and ran, attempting to escape, but the prince would not allow it and he shouted out a spell, "No ion." A bright blue snake sprang forth from the prince's palm and latched itself onto the man's arm, but the spell was not strong enough and the man got away as he jumped from the balcony. The prince, feeling defeated, mumbled an expletive in frustration. He looked at his little sister apologetically as he said that they would have to postpone their tea party. He didn't wait for a reply, the pain from his wound making him dizzy, and walked away. As he limped slowly, still clutching his side, he thought about the magic he'd encountered today. It was an ancient language he'd never heard of, and that attack spell was something he'd never seen before. Since he was well versed in both Roksek and Siberian, that only left Wayrak. He needed to investigate the man because if that man ever mastered that spell, he knew he'd be no match for him, and he wouldn't be able to protect Riley. He closed his eyes, and that was the last thought he had before everything went black. His eyes shot open as he jolted awake, disorientated. He found himself laying on the ground with a dirty, tattered rug covering him as a makeshift blanket. He sat up, still confused, and that feeling only grew as he saw a little raven-haired girl lying next to him. She looked to be about Riley's age, and he immediately knew who she was because of her long dark hair. So this was Ashtart Forenza. She clung to his bloody sleeve, sleeping soundly. She was a princess, but she was dressed too shabby, with a dirty brown dress. He looked around and his eyes found a bucket of water with some dirty rags. It appeared to be rags from treating his wound. He sighed as he remembered he was on the Empress Palace grounds. How had he ended up there? He looked at the sleeping girl and his hand reached out for her. She was the darkness that everyone told him to avoid. But his hand stopped as he recalled the words spoken to him all his life. He was to be the perfect emperor. And the perfect emperor was to show no pity and remorse, he was to be merciless. Words that grappled him by the neck since a young age. The words spoken by the first empress. He felt suffocated, and he couldn't understand these emotions. Why did he feel this way? It was unlike him, and he'd never see this little girl again, just like it's been all those years. He walked away from the rosy-cheeked girl, and he steeled his heart once more because he knew their paths would never cross again. They would continue to live as they always have. He looked at Loina as he told her that he'd thought that to be their last meeting, but when looking for Sir Ashton again, he'd met her once more. He also wanted to repay her for the help he'd received from her. But Loina would not let down her walls so easily, even after hearing his explanation. Was that the only reason he'd come to the Empress's palace? She questioned. But the prince had more to say. If he could have it his way, he'd leave the princess alone just as Loina had wished, but, what is this? He questioned as he looked around the empress's palace. It's almost like a ruined palace, he shouted out. Why was the princess living in such a way? Loina said nothing in the face of the prince's disbelief. I must see it for myself, lead the way to the princess's room. Loina turned and did as she was told. Sir Ashton followed and the prince, behind him. As Sir Ashton took to the stairs, the wood under his foot gave out with a loud splintering sound, a sound which alarmed him. Wasn't this dangerous, he questioned, but all Loina told him was that they didn't have the funds to fix it. She'd tried asking for more money, but she'd never received a response from the palace, so their winters were always cold, and they were always hungry. It was a never-ending vicious cycle that left their hearts always aching. As the prince listened to Loina speak, his heart throbbed painfully, and he frowned. Loina smiled bitterly as she told them that she'd always had her eyes on the princess who held on to the hope that one day she'd meet her family. She turned away swiftly as she continued up the stairs. She explained that the princess was a child incapable of resenting anyone and Loina feared that someday, someone would trample on the pure heart she possessed. As they walked the stairs creaked and groaned, a clear sign of the state of the building. As they arrived at the princess's room, Loina opened the door and the sight that greeted the prince stole his breath. The room that the princess stayed in was decent, but only for a servant. To think a member of the royal family stayed in a room fit for a servant, the prince couldn't fathom it. Had nobody discovered the state of this place even though it had become like this? He remembered the princess shyly asking for something as she'd told him she'd not had much, so was this what she meant? He walked to her wardrobe and opened it to reveal dirty-looking, worn-out dresses. He'd truly not known that she'd meant she'd not had enough money to buy even a single dress. She would have had to continue to wear these dresses had he not gifted her new ones. His anger grew the more he thought about it. Was this all she had to wear? He clenched his jaw as he tried to suppress his rage at his own ignorance. The biting words he'd told her as he'd mockingly gave his thanks to her for covering him with a tattered carpet and the look on her face as she'd stood there receiving his scorn. Why did he say that? The regret now weighed heavy on him. But soon he was left stunned as he spotted amongst all her shabby clothes a pristine, fur-lined cloak that laid folded neatly. He snatched the cloak from the wardrobe because clearly, what he saw must have been wrong. But no, it really was a blue cloak with pure white fur. He looked back at Loina as he demanded an answer. Where did you get this? He said, furious red eyes pointed at Loina. His voice held panic, but even he couldn't comprehend the reason for that. He'd recognized that cloak. Without a doubt that was the cloak that Noah usually wore. But until recently, Noah would appear without his cloak. Had he already met Princess Ashtart? But why hadn't he mentioned it? The thought made Prince Miragen nauseous. Loina, who was oblivious to the crown prince's erratic emotions as he listened to her, told him that no matter how many times she'd told the princess to throw it away, it was no use for the princess treasured the cloak too much. Because this was the first gift she'd ever received from her family, she would not discard it as Loina had wished. She recalled her conversation with the princess as she'd happily told Loina that she met someone else from the imperial family, all the while she'd hugged the cloak to her. She'd told Loina that he'd told her that he'd given it to her because it was his responsibility as family, and she'd refused to wear it lest it got dirty. Loina had dreaded this very situation because she knew that the princess would soon be disappointed by the imperial family, and so she asked the princess gently, "Do you like His Majesty and the princes, despite never having seen them?" Loina crouched down in front of the princess and Ashtart had questioned her in confusion. She'd looked deeply into the princess's eyes as she'd asked earnestly, "Is it impossible for you to not like them, even if I plead with you like this?" Loina implored the princess to listen to her but she knew deep down it was no use. The princess longed too much for the affection of her family. But the princess, with her eyes downcast, told Loina how much she wanted to but she couldn't change how she felt. She'd hugged Loina and she'd hung on to the princess's clothes. And her words only broke Loina down further. She'd told Loina that she taught the princess to love others unconditionally, so how could she let them go? The prince realized that was the reason why she'd lied about buying the dresses for Ashtart. She hadn't wanted Ashtart to get her hopes up knowing the prince had gifted her a dress, the prince questioned, but he knew that to be true. She looked at the prince as she asked him if he knew that time could not be turned back, and that was the reason she'd wanted the princess to forget. Prince Miragen thought about the day he'd broken Ashtart's heart at the ruined tea party. He was angry and he couldn't understand the reason for such emotions, and in the end, he'd taken his frustrations out on Ashtart. He squeezed the cloak in his hands as it weighed heavy on him, these petty actions that had hurt and made her cry. Would it have been different if he'd reached out at least once upon their first meeting? That incessant ache in his chest throbbed once more as the prince came to a realization. He laughed self-deprecatingly as it occurred to him, her worn-out clothes, her tears. It wasn't because he was ignorant, but because he chose to turn a blind eye. He purposely ignored her. No matter the rumor of her being the darkness, when he'd first seen her, how lovely she'd looked to him, and he'd wanted to see her again. And when their unexpected meeting in the garden had pleased him, because his heart had already accepted Ashtart as his sister. When he'd heard her ask him for a dress because she lacked the funds, he'd felt anger at those who hadn't offered her the help she'd needed. And when she'd called him brother in her sweet voice, the guilt he'd felt because he'd never taken care of her had welled up in him, and he'd lashed out at her. How he'd wanted to see her smile happily and freely from burden. He whispered her name softly, anguish coated her name, as tears ran freely down his face. He didn't move as he cried silently, choking with regret for allowing his little sister to suffer in silence. Something dripped on her face and Ashtart opened her eyes slowly. She saw Ryan who had a wet cloth in his hands, and she asked, hesitantly, if she'd fainted after using too much magic again. He'd laid the cloth on her head as he told her in a lightly scolding tone that she'd been pushing herself too much. As he patted her hand, he ordered her to rest for the day. Ashtart stubbornly tried to protest, and Ryan quickly bribed her with a raspberry sandwich for the morning if she listened. And Ashtart, who was weak to food, cheerfully agreed. Ryan smiled at her lightning-fast answer. And as he got up to leave, Ashtart called out his name as she grabbed onto his sleeve. He stared at her bewildered, and as she realized she still held on to him, she let out a soft sound of surprise and nervously stuttered out her question. "Could you stay with me a little while longer?" Her cheeks red with embarrassment, as she babbled that she wouldn't bother him, and he didn't even have to stay long. 5 minutes more, or even just a minute would do. Ryan sat on the bed as he told her that if she wanted, he could stay with her until she fell asleep. But then he asked her a question and the usual dangerous glint he had in his eyes during their first meeting returned. "Who told you that asking someone to sit by your side was a hopelessly stubborn thing to do?" Ashtart's sixth sense tinged as she looked at him, the same feeling she got when Loina blazed with fury at Ashtart getting hurt. And Ryan looked exactly like Loina when she got angry. Ashtart thought about the one other time Ryan had looked rather angry, and it was when he seemed frustrated that she didn't seem to put much value in herself. Ashtart smiled as she thought that Ryan might be worried for her once again, but the truth was that she was afraid, she admitted quietly. She'd never been stubborn when it came to listening to the requests of the one person who loved her. Ryan seemed to realize what her fear was, and he asked her if she feared being hated. Ashtart nodded and then tacked on that because her family held no love for her, she'd been scared that Ryan would want to leave her too, and he flinched at her words. He looked at her with a saddened gaze as he thought about Ashtart who would in fact be the one leaving him. He called her name and Ashtart looked up at him and he asked her if she'd enjoyed living here with him and he wanted to know if she'd like to stay here longer. His eyes were pools of loneliness as he tried to hold on to his one source of happiness in his otherwise empty life, and when she looked at him with those glimmering golden eyes, he smiled a bittersweet smile because it was hopeless. He couldn't keep her by his side. It wouldn't be fair to Loina, who waited for her, he told her, and Ashtart agreed. She remembered the glowing smile Loina always gave her, and Ashtart squeezed her eyes closed tightly to fight off the throbbing pain in her chest. But why couldn't it have been a person from her family who waited for her return? And that thought hurt her all the more. But she still held on to the hope that someday, her wish would come true. A wish that she'd prayed for in her last moments in her former life. She looked at her worn-out hands and she said the words aloud. She didn't want to give up yet, her wish to be loved by everyone for a long time. Was it so wrong to hold on to such a dream? Ryan's larger hand encased hers gently as he told her that while it wasn't wrong to hold on to such a dream, she couldn't make everyone in the world love her unconditionally. He put it in her hands and his chains jiggled from the motion. Her eyes widened at the object he'd placed in her hands. You don't need to waste your love on everyone as well. Because she already had someone who loved her 100 times as much. It was the lily of the valley hairpin that Ashtart thought she'd lost. Her voice rose as she wanted to ask him where he had found it, but he stopped her. He closed his eyes, unable to face her as he apologized. He hadn't kept it from her on purpose, he tried to explain but stopped as his eyes shot open at her sudden action. She threw herself at him and she hugged him tightly as she thanked him. She cried tears of happiness and relief that Ryan had found it. Her precious hairpin, gifted to her by the one person who'd always showered her in love. Ryan listened to her little cries, and he'd wanted to keep her close because he'd thought it would have been beneficial to her, but he knew that was just his own selfishness. It upset him, but he knew he couldn't keep her with him any longer. He didn't want to be the cause of anyone's hardships ever again. He spoke softly in her ear as she quieted down. He told her that she didn't need to try so hard to be loved because in his eyes she was more than deserving of it. So he would let her go to the one who loved her and needed her. After she'd fallen asleep, Ryan sat and gazed at her for some time. He got up and put her spell book on a bookshelf reachable to her. How he'd wished they could have met much sooner. He never expected her to learn magic at such a fast rate. Was it her talent or was it because of her strong resolve? She'd given him a hope he'd never had before and it might have been too late for him, but Ashtart still had a chance. And her appearance had been a ray of light in the darkness that was his life. And starting today, he'd bet on his destiny to be with her. He put the book within her reach, but he still hoped she'd find it as late as possible. And when Ashtart awoke, she'd stretched but a thought occurred to her, she must have been pushing herself too hard. Ryan had explained to her that if a spell was incomplete or interrupted, it would be more draining to the caster. It puzzled her because Ryan knew a lot about magic, but when he'd held her back, she'd felt the magic as it severed. And she wondered if he'd blocked her on purpose so that she couldn't go back. But that was a rather ridiculous thought. Ashtart laughed at the silliness of her imagination. She knew he wouldn't have done that because he'd offered her help when she'd come here so unexpectedly. She pinned her hairpin in place as she thought about it. Nothing good would have come out of keeping her here, she smiled sadly. He had no reason to hold on to her. And thinking about him made her realize that she was alone in the room. Where had he gone? He wasn't in the next room as well, his usual place, but his whereabouts were soon forgotten as her eyes caught onto the bookshelf. And the Crown Prince's magic book sat on the shelf, moonlight cast off its golden frame. And at this height, Ashtart was certain she could reach it.